Hi, and welcome to another training refresher for the SREB Literacy Ready course. This refresher focuses on English Unit 1, Lesson 6, and the activity involved is on writing a synthesis paragraph. In this activity, students will work with a partner or small group to write and revise a synthesis paragraph of the strongest evidence that Carr uses related to a quote from Chapter 8, which was read for homework. The first step in this activity is reviewing the focus quote with students. So I'm going to read through the quote and then talk a little bit about what students might focus on in terms of developing a claim that they're going to support with evidence from the text. So the quote says, "Google is neither God nor Satan, and if there are shadows in the Googleplex, they're no more than the delusions of grandeur. What's disturbing about the company's founders is not their boyish desire to create an amazingly cool machine that will be able to outthink its creators, but the pinched conception of the human mind that gives rise to such a desire." Now, this quote is found at the end of this chapter, and it really is part of the summing up that Carr does of this chapter, which focuses on Google, Larry Page, the Googleplex, and the kind of Taylorism that Google adopts in its efforts to be efficient and to provide people with the most efficient set of data possible in the quickest amount of time. So the first step for you in working with students is going to be to review this quote for them and to talk through what this quote is actually saying. And one of the things that you're going to want students to do is to sort of articulate for themselves what is the claim that they're going to be looking for evidence on, or what are the potential claims that they might look for evidence on. So, in looking at this quote, students might focus on the first part that says Google is neither God nor Satan. That is a claim, but it may not be the best one for them to focus on. There's evidence that you could find, a lot of evidence showing that Carr tends to think that Google is kind of evil, but sort of the dual nature of this particular phrase makes it less interesting as a claim. So I would try to steer students away from that particular portion. So I've highlighted in red here some of the things that you might want them to focus on. So one is that perhaps the Googleplex is having delusions of grandeur. You will be able to find, and the students will be able to find, some evidence in Chapter 8 that supports this notion that Google as a company and the Googleplex as the whole industry of Google really is getting a little too big for their britches, so to speak, and maybe having delusions of grandeur. You might encourage students to focus on this notion that the company's founders have a pinched conception of the human mind, and that's why they desire to create this cool machine that can outthink its creators. On any of those pieces, students will be able to find lots of good evidence. So as you talk through this with students, just help them to understand kind of what the quote is saying and what they might be choosing to look for. Now, you don't want them to narrow down their focus too early, because what they're going to try to do, working with a partner or with a small group, is to find the strongest evidence to support a claim. And then they're going to need to write a synthesis paragraph. And their synthesis paragraph obviously should state the claim and then state the evidence that supports it. So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of evidence students might find. First of all, students might find commentary or reasoning in Carr's voice. So this is Carr's argument, his explication of what he thinks based on partly on the evidence he's finding and partly on his own perspective. So an example would be this quote from page 168, where Carr says, "The development of a well-rounded mind requires both an ability to find and quickly parse a wide range of information and a capacity for open-ended reflection. There needs to be time for efficient data collection and time for inefficient contemplation, time to operate the machine and time to sit idly in the garden. We need to work in Google's world of numbers, but we also need to be able to retreat to Sleepy Hollow. The problem today is that we're losing our ability to strike a balance between those two very different states of mind. Mentally, we're in perpetual locomotion. So this quote actually connects quite well to the last part of the previous slide, where Carr is saying that the work of Google represents a pinched conception of the human mind. So this might be a piece of evidence that your students might find. They'll find other places in the text where Carr is talking about the human mind, what the human mind needs, Google, things like that. In addition, students might find quotes from others that Carr uses to build his argument. And one example is this quote from Irene Au on page 156, where Irene Au says, "Our goal is to get users in and out really quickly. All our design decisions are based on that strategy." So this quote could be used sort of to support the notion that the pinched conception of the human mind is all about efficiency, something like that. Your students might also find information about Larry Page or about Google or something else. So here's a quote about Larry Page from page 153. "His friends remember him as being ambitious, smart, and nearly obsessed with efficiency." So these are only sample quotes that your students might find, and they might very well not pick any of these, but most likely they'll be choosing text from this chapter that includes Carr's own voice, a quote from someone else, or some information about Google or about Larry Page. So remember that students are choosing their quotes, working with a partner or a small group. The reason we have this set up in small groups or partners is so that they can have some support, working with another person to choose the most evidence. If your students would prefer to work alone and you feel like they're capable of that, perfectly okay to do that. Basically, what students are going to be doing is drafting their synthesis paragraph of the evidence. So you're going to need to rotate around, walk around the classroom, work with students to help them be clear on the claim, find the right evidence, and put their evidence together into a rough draft synthesis paragraph. So you might be thinking about helping them draft a topic sentence, helping them embed any quotations in the sentence, helping them string sentences together so that it makes a coherent paragraph, all of that kind of thing. When the groups are finished writing their draft synthesis paragraphs, you're going to ask some groups to volunteer their drafts. It might be a good idea as you're working with students to write these, to sort of pick on a particular set of groups to volunteer their paragraphs. And the reason for this is because you really want some paragraphs to be submitted that are not perfect, but are also not really, really terrible. So you want something in sort of in the middle that you and your students can provide some feedback on that can be helpful, that everyone can then take back and use on their own. So it's a good idea as you're sort of circling around the room to ask a couple of groups maybe to volunteer their paragraphs. And then, of course, if others volunteer, fine. So what you're going to do here is put those paragraphs up on either on a smartboard using a document camera or write them on the whiteboard, whatever you've got, so that the whole class can read and evaluate them. And you're going to look at these 4 questions to do that evaluation. So does the synthesis paragraph have a strong topic sentence? If not, how can we strengthen it? And this would be a great time to, write some notes on that topic sentence, have the class as a whole, help you make revisions, that kind of thing. Second, are the sources included in the synthesis clear? What about the citations? And if they're not clear, how can they be clarified? Now, this is a fairly simple set of citations to use because they're all coming from Carr. Good practice, though, on embedding those citations in the writing of the paragraph. Third, is what the synthesis talking about clear at any given moment? How might the synthesis information be clarified? And here you're looking at the body of the paragraph. Is the writing clear? Are the sentences appropriately structured? That kind of thing. And finally, were there any points in the synthesis where you were lost because a transition was missing? If so, where is it and how might it be corrected? So you're going to work through a couple, maybe 3, depending on how big your class is and how much time you have, sample paragraphs. And the end result should be that students go back to their own paragraph, whether or not it was one that was used as a sample, and make revisions based on the modeling that they received here. So depending on the kind of classroom community you have in place, this will be more or less successful. So you want to have a classroom community that supports risk-taking in writing and rewards revision. The whole goal here is for students to see that even if their writing is good, it can be made stronger. If it's poor, it can be improved. So some things that you can do to set up this kind of classroom community. First of all, you can show them your own rough draft writing and how you revise a rough draft. So some modeling work, particularly if your students are not comfortable with this kind of an atmosphere. Before you ask students to model their synthesis paragraphs, you might model something of your own. Even when something is not perfect, you need to show what needs to be done to improve it. So that's the whole point here, is to say, hey, whatever we've got written, we can make it stronger. And then encourage your students to practice constructive criticism with the idea that we're all working on this together to improve our writing and reading skills. This is always a tricky balance because we often identify ourselves with our own writing, and it's sometimes hard to hear criticism, whether it's constructive or not. So helping your students sort of by modeling for them what a good constructive comment looks like and sounds like, and really stepping in if they begin to offer criticism that is not constructive. That's an important thing to setting up this kind of classroom community. Okay, so students have written a rough draft, they have shared some samples of their rough drafts, done some whole class revision work, gone back to their original rough draft, revised, and at this point, after they've revised, if time allows, it'd be a great idea to ask a few of them to read their paragraphs out loud and to talk about what revisions they made based on feedback they received on their own paragraph or feedback they saw others receiving. And then finally in this activity is a wrap-up discussion. And I would encourage you not to leave this out because it really will cement the content of the chapter and also the connections between claim and evidence and their synthesizing skills, which, if you'll remember, are going to be very important at the end of this unit when they have to write a synthesis essay. So there's some potential discussion and follow-up questions you could ask. These are not included in the lesson plans, but there's some ways that you could start off a discussion. So you could ask students to talk about what is currently their perspective on Carr's claim about Google. Do they buy what he's saying at the end of this chapter? Is Google God or Satan? Does Google have delusions of grandeur or a pinched conception of the human mind? That might be something that would engender some interesting conversation. And then you might also have them do a little metacognitive work by asking, what do you think is the strongest evidence? What's the most convincing? What's the least convincing? Why do you think this? Why did you choose the evidence that you chose in your paragraph? Why did you think it was the strongest? And, this is an important piece because ultimately, when they write their synthesis essay, they need to be able to pull quality evidence from whatever sources they're using for that synthesis essay. Well, that's all we have on this activity. As always, thank you so much for the work you're doing with students, and I wish you the best as you continue to help your students be ready for college. Thanks, and bye-bye.